Now, Australia has had its biggest one-day jump in coronavirus cases for quite some time, with a relatively high figure in Victoria. New South Wales was a stark contrast this morning to Victoria, with just one new case in New South Wales. And Queensland has made a major announcement about schools returning. So here are today's key developments. Victoria has recorded 22 new cases overnight. 19 of those are in connection to that cluster at an abattoir in Melbourne. 2 separate cases have been detected at schools in Victoria and New South Wales. A teacher in Melbourne's north tested positive, while a school on Sydney's outskirts is closed after a student contracted COVID-19. The return to school in Queensland will begin in stages from next Monday. Kindy Prep Years 1, 11 and 12 can return from May the 11th, so next Monday. Years 2 to 10 will continue with remote learning until they are planned to return in 3 weeks' time on May the 25th. Tough new measures are being introduced at that Western Sydney aged care home where 14 residents have died. Every staff member arriving for work will be tested, and some residents are being moved to another part of the facility. The US is intensifying its attack on China, claiming it deliberately misled the world over the outbreak. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has repeated allegations that the virus was man-made and escaped from a Wuhan laboratory. He says there's enormous evidence of that. Russia and China have both recorded their highest daily number of new cases, with more than 10,500 in Russia and 2,500 in India. Meanwhile, Brazil has become the first country in Latin America to record more than 100,000 cases. European countries which are beginning to ease restrictions include Italy, Spain and the UK. Britain is also preparing to launch a virus tracing app, as is France. So Victoria has recorded 22 new cases of coronavirus overnight, with 19 of those connected to a cluster at an abattoir in Melbourne. Reporter Steph Ferrier has more from Melbourne.
We've heard from our Chief Health Officer, Professor Brett Sutton, who says that most of these 19 new cases, they were actually asymptomatic, but luckily they had already been placed in quarantine as a result of being in contact with previously identified cases. So at least there's no concern or risk about public exposure there. Now, 2 more cases in those 22 relate to returning travellers from international destinations. So they're already in quarantine in hotels, and there's only one case where the cause is still being investigated. Now, Professor Brett Sutton also shed some more light on that music teacher from Meadow Glen Primary School in Epping in Melbourne's north, who tested positive yesterday, prompting the closure of that school until at least Thursday. He says that case originated from a close contact of this particular music teacher who had already tested positive. Now, it was good though that the music teacher did go and get himself tested, even though he only had a slight cough. So the principal says that everybody was very surprised that in fact he'd returned a positive test, and he had been working at the school the previous week, although thankfully not in a contact role with students, because there were about 70 students or so that turned up last week for classes there. Now, the school will remain in closure for a very thorough clean until, as I mentioned, this Thursday, and there are 2 other staff members who've been placed in isolation while the health department continues to work through all of those potential contacts. We did hear from Premier Daniel Andrews, and he's really dismissed any of the stinging criticism made by Dan Tehan, the Federal Education Minister, as ancient history. He did say in the press conference that he watched the ABC Insiders program when Dan Tehan really gave him a bit of a serve, accusing him of a failure of leadership, of putting into jeopardy the national consensus on schooling, and also of taking a sledgehammer approach to returning to classrooms. Now, Dan Tehan did have to come back some hours later, and he retracted those statements, saying that it was as a result of his frustration that had vented, that he'd overstepped the mark, and that he withdrew all of those comments relating to Daniel Andrews' leadership. But Daniel Andrews did say that really at the moment, in this time of coronavirus, Victorians don't want to see this sort of political stoush.
Fighting amongst ourselves is not what's needed. Fighting this virus is what's most important. Comments were made yesterday morning, a statement was issued after that. That's the end of the matter as far as I'm concerned. While they were doing that, I'll tell you what I was doing. We were out there getting 13,000 people tested, and that's what's most important. I don't think any state's tested that many people in a single day. and that's really powerful. That's what gives us those options. That's what gives us the confidence, pending the results, of course, gives us the confidence to maybe change some of these rules.
Yeah, so there's the Premier, Daniel Andrews of Victoria, standing firm on his decision not to return students to classroom until the end of term 2, so for the foreseeable future. So that really leaves Victoria as the lone state after we've just heard from the Queensland government there with return to classes as of May the 25th.
From May the 11th, and I know there's a lot of people who've been waiting for this, including my family members. From May the 11th, there will be Kindy, Prep, and years 11 and 12 will be going back to school. So this is great news, and of course we know how important those early years are. We also know how important year 11s and 12s are, especially when they're trying to finish that education, especially in year 12. It's a very important year. So from May the 11th, Kindy and Prep years 11s and 12s will return to school. On May the 15th, that's always been our date for assessment. We're going to assess once again how our restrictions are working and how our numbers are going. And on May the 25th, that is our date for the proposed reopening to remaining students and grades across Queensland. So by the end of this month, May the 25th, we should, where practicable, have nearly all of our schools operating in Queensland. And of course I say that with caution, because if there is any rise between now and May 25th, we have to act cautiously. But this is our plan. This is our plan for Queenslanders, to give Queenslanders some certainty over the school year.
Stephanie Ferrier reporting that from Melbourne. A school in Sydney's west has been closed after a student tested positive for coronavirus. Lara Hyams reports from Sydney.
Well, the details about this all came out from the Premier's briefing this morning. We know that 5,500 tests were carried out in New South Wales. The day before actually recorded 4 cases of coronavirus in New South Wales, and it was revealed today that the state has only recorded 1 case. So an improvement in the statistics of coronavirus in New South Wales. However, sadly, that one person who has tested positive is a 7-year-old boy. He is a student at the Warragamba School, which is located in Sydney's western suburbs. This is a school that caters for those in kindergarten to year 6. And as a result, that school has been closed today to undergo extensive cleaning. Now, this all comes on the back of the issue of schools, which has been dominating national and state headlines. We know that in New South Wales, the Premier has been firm in her rollout plan for the resumption of classes. It appears that it's still on track for that, where students will return in week 3 as some kind of face-to-face contact where students can be in the classroom. There is also a plan to expedite some of the classes for year 12 students, particularly in state schools. But she did warn that as students go back to school, there's likely to be some more cases of students who test positive to the virus. But she wants residents and those teachers and parents in New South Wales to have confidence in the protocols that are in place.
This is likely to occur on a more regular basis when schools go back, but we've demonstrated from our experience in term 1 best practice when it comes to isolating a case, shutting down a school, doing a deep clean and then resuming activities as soon as possible once contacts have been established. So whilst it's happened again today, I anticipate it will happen more frequently, but please have confidence that we've gone through all the processes and we know what it takes to keep everybody safe when that occurs.
New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian speaking there this morning. And Lara, what's the latest on the situation at Newmarch House? That's this aged care facility in Sydney's west where more than 10 people have died.
Well, sadly, there's been another death recorded there over the weekend. This is a 76-year-old resident, and Faye, she actually died at Nepean Hospital. Now, that is where they have ICU capability. We do know that the death toll from this particular aged care facility now stands at 14. So this particular centre has been one of the biggest on-land clusters of coronavirus in Australia. It's actually recorded 63 cases. 37 of those are residents. The rest are staff. Now, as a result, Anglicare has implemented a raft of measures, and starting from today, all workers who will be at the centre will be tested for coronavirus, so that will be on a daily basis. We know that the residents who also test negative to the virus will actually be relocated, so they'll be moved to another wing of the aged care facility to separate them from those who have tested positive. And in addition to that, there will be more staffing, so infectious disease specialists will be on hand to assist in stopping the spread of the virus.
US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has backed Australia's call for an independent inquiry into the origin of coronavirus in China and backed claims that the virus originated in a Wuhan lab. Here's North America correspondent David Lipson in Washington.
This, of course, comes off the back of strong language that we've been hearing from everyone right up to the President Donald Trump against China over the past few weeks. But what we heard from Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, this morning is that he really doubled down on President Trump's claim that there was overwhelming evidence to suggest that the pandemic originated in a lab in Wuhan. He said that there was enormous evidence that that is exactly what happened. And he's also today accused China of intent. And that is in relation to the information or lack thereof that came out of China in the early weeks of this virus outbreak. He said that he can confirm that the Chinese Communist Party did all that it could to make sure that the world didn't learn in a timely fashion about what was taking place. Take a listen.
China behaved like authoritarian regimes do, attempted to conceal and hide and confuse. It employed the World Health Organization as a tool to do the same. These are the kind of things that have now presented this enormous crisis, an enormous loss of life, and tremendous economic cost all across the globe. The Australians agree with that. You hear the Europeans beginning to say the same thing. I think the whole world is united, understanding that China brought this virus to the world.
That's Mike Pompeo there, the US Secretary of State. And remember, this is in the context of a threat from the President Donald Trump that there would be, quote, consequences if China was found to have been knowingly responsible for the pandemic that has been crushing the world.
David Lipson there in Washington. Adults in Spain have been allowed to exercise outside for the first time in 7 weeks. The relaxation in rules came as Italy, Spain and Britain all recorded their lowest daily death tolls in weeks. Here's Europe correspondent Linton Besser.
That curve is dipping away, but it's important to remember Spain and Italy account for 53,000 and counting deaths in just 3 months. I mean, that's getting up towards 5,000 people a week. And those countries have been completely devastated, and they were placed under really strict lockdowns. And of course, these are countries where most people live in apartments. And you know, the way of life there just changed so dramatically, so quickly. The health services were pushed beyond breaking point. Well, that is now starting to change. And Madrid and Rome are now easing some of these restrictions. In Spain, as you say, it'll be the first time in 7 weeks that adults are allowed outside to exercise. Imagine that. I mean, they've been allowed to go to the shops and down to the pharmacy, but being allowed to take a walk around the park now, you know, is a right that's been returned to them. Other restrictions are going to be lifted. Small shops and barbers and hardware stores will reopen tomorrow under strict rules, the most important of which is that face masks are now going to be mandatory in Spain and Italy on public transport. If you want to travel across a region, if you want to cross Puglia, you're allowed to now to go and visit relatives or attend a funeral, but you've got to be wearing a face mask. We're used to those kinds of scenes in Asia. It now looks like it'll become the way of life in Europe for the foreseeable future. Vladimir Putin and the mayor of Moscow have both, raised a bit of a question mark about any easing of the lockdown. They say the curve, the peak hasn't been reached in Russia. It's a strange case, Russia. They've had only, I say only, they've had 1,200 plus deaths there. It's a terrible number, but, talking about Spain and Italy and France and the UK for that, it's a smaller number, but just overnight they've had a huge spike, the highest daily number ever, more than 10,000 cases in just 24 hours. The authorities are hoping that's just because of improved testing, something that, mind you, the UK could do a little better. But they're going to have to wait and see. The restrictions were meant to be lifted on May 11, but they're not counting their chickens yet.
Singapore has reported more than 650 new coronavirus cases. That was for yesterday as the country prepared to start easing its restrictions. Just 10 of the new cases were Singaporean permanent residents, with the vast majority of other cases being foreign workers living in dormitories. Singapore has largely curbed the spread of the disease among locals outside the dormitories. The country's total death toll stands at just 18. Italy has registered the lowest daily number of coronavirus-related deaths since just after its lockdown began 2 months ago. The country is now preparing to relax some of its tougher restrictions on people's movements. 174 more people died yesterday, so there was still 174 deaths. But in terms of comparing that to what's happened, that's relatively low. The numbers of those currently infected with the virus and of patients in intensive care continues to fall. From today, Italians are able to exercise outside. They'll also be able to visit relatives, but not friends within their region.